Hello, we're getting ready to read Frindle. We'll be reading 2 chapters. And I messed up last week. I should have read or on Monday, I should have read all of chapter 5, but I only read part of it. I missed a few pages. So I'm going to go back and read that right now. Okay. Who says dog means dog? Then Mrs. Granger went on, but of course that dictionary was worked on by hundreds of very smart people for many years. So as far as we are concerned, that dictionary is the law. Laws can change, of course, but only if they need to. There may be new words that need to be made, but the ones in that book have been put there for good reasons. Mrs. Granger took a look at the clock. 8 minutes left. And now then, for today, you were to have done the exercises beginning on page 12 in your Words Alive book. Please get out your papers. Sarah, will you read the first sentence, identify the mistake, and then tell us how you corrected it? Mrs. Granger jammed the whole day's work into the last 8 minutes, a blur of verbs and nouns and prepositions, and yes, there was another homework assignment. And Nick didn't try to sidetrack Mrs. G again. He had slowed her down a little, but had he stopped her? No way. She was unstoppable, at least for today. Chapter 6, The Big Idea. 3 things happened later that same afternoon. Nick and Janet Fisk had missed the bus because of a school newspaper meeting, so they walked home together. They were seeing who could walk along the curb without falling. It took a lot of concentration. And when Janet stepped off into the street, Nick said, "That's 3 points for me." But Janet said, "I didn't fall. I saw something. Look." She bent down and picked up a gold ballpoint pen, the fancy kind. That was the first thing, Janet finding the pen. They got back on the curb, and Nick followed Janet, putting one foot carefully in front of the other on the narrow concrete curb. And while he stepped along, he thought back over the school day, especially about his report, and what Mrs. Granger had said about words at the end of the period finally sank in. That was the second thing, understanding what Mrs. Granger had said. She had said, "Who says dog means dog? You do, Nicholas." "You do, Nicholas," he repeated to himself. "I do?" Nick thought, still putting one foot in front of the other, following Janet. "What does that mean?" And then Nick remembered something. When he was about 2 years old, his mom had bought him one of those unbreakable cassette players and a bunch of sing-along tapes. He had loved them, and he played them over and over and over and over. He would carry the tape and the player to his mother, his big brother, or his father, and bang them together and say, "Guagla, guagla, guagla," until someone put the cassette in the machine and turned it on. And for 3 years, whenever he said "Guagla," his family knew that he wanted to hear those pretty sounds made with voices and instruments. Then, when Nick went to preschool, he learned that if he wanted his teacher and other kids to understand him, he had to use the word music. But "guagla" meant that nice sound to Nick, because Nick said so. Who says "guagla" means music? You do, Nicholas. "No fair," yelled Janet. They were at the corner of their own street, and Nick had bumped into her. Completely absorbed in his thoughts, Janet stumbled off the curb and the gold pin in her hand cluttered into the street. "Sorry, I didn't mean to, honest," said Nick. "I just wasn't watching. Here." Nick stooped over and picked up the pen and held it out to her. "Here's your—" And that's when the third thing happened. Nick didn't say pen. Instead, he said, "Here's your Frindle." Frindle? Janet took her pen and looked at him like he was nuts. She wrinkled her nose and said, "What's a Frindle?" Nick grinned and said, "You'll find out. See you later." It was there at the corner of Spring Street and South Grand Avenue, 1 block from home, on a September afternoon. That's when Nick got the big idea. The big idea. And by the time he had run down the street and up the steps and through the door and upstairs to his room, it wasn't just a big idea. It was a plan, a whole plan, just begging for Nick to put into action. And action was Nick's middle name. The next day after school, the plan began. Nick walked into the penny pantry store and asked the lady behind the counter for a Frindle. She squinted at him. "A what?" A Frindle, please, a black one. And Nick smiled at her. She leaned over closer and aimed one ear at him. You want what? A Frindle. And this time Nick pointed at the ballpoint pens behind her on the shelf. A black one, please. The lady handed Nick the pen. He handed her the 49 cents and said thank you and left the store. 6 days later, Janet stood at the counter of the penny pantry. Same store, same lady. John had come in the day before, and Pete the day before that, and Chris the day before that, and Dave the day before that. Janet was the fifth kid that Nick had sent there to ask that woman for a Frindle. And when she asked, the lady reached right for the pens and said, blue or black. Nick was standing one aisle away at the candy racks, and he was grinning. Frindle was a real word. It meant pen. Who says Frindle means pen? You do, Nicholas. Half an hour later, a group of serious fifth graders had a meeting in Nick's playroom. It was John, Pete, Dave, Chris, and Janet. Add Nick and the 6 kids. 6 secret agents. They held up their right hands and read the oath Nick had written out. From this day on and forever, I will never use the word pen again. Instead, I will use the word Frindle, and I will do everything possible so others will too. And all 6 of them signed the oath with Nick's Frindle. The plan would work. Thanks, Mrs. Granger. Chapter 7, Word Wars. School was the perfect place to launch a new word, and since this was a major historical event, Nick wanted it to begin in exactly the right class. 7th period language arts. Nick raised his hand first thing after the bell rang and said, Mrs. Granger, I forgot my Frindle. Sitting 3 rows away, John blurted out, I have an extra one you could borrow, Nick. Then John made a big show of looking for something in his backpack. I think I have an extra Frindle. I told my mom to get me 3 or 4. I'm sure I had an extra Frindle in here yesterday, but I must have taken it. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, here it is. And then John made a big show of throwing it over to Nick, and Nick missed it on purpose. Then he made a big show of finding it. Mrs. Granger and every kid in the class got the message loud and clear. That black plastic thing that Nick borrowed from John had a funny name, a different name, a new name, Frindle. There was a lot of giggling, but Mrs. Granger turned up the power in her eyes and swept the room into silence, and the rest of the class went by according to plan, her plan. As everyone was leaving for class, Mrs. Granger said, Nicholas, I'd like to have a word with you. And she emphasized the word. Nick's mouth felt dry and he gulped, but his mind stayed clear. He walked up to his desk. Yes, Mrs. Granger. It's a funny idea, Nicholas, but I will not have my class disrupted again. Is that clear? Her eyes were lit up, but it was mostly light, not much heat. Idea? What idea? Asked Nick, and he tried to make his eyes as blank as possible. You know what I mean, Nicholas. I'm talking about the performance that you and John gave at the start of class. I am talking about this. And she held up her pen, an old maroon fountain pen with a blue cap. But I really didn't have a Frindle with me, said Nick, amazed at his own bravery. And hiding behind his glasses, Nick kept his eyes wide and blank. Mrs. Granger's eyes flashed and then narrowed, and her lips formed a thin, hard line. She was quiet for a few seconds, and then she said, I see. Very well. Then I guess we have nothing more to discuss today, Nicholas. You may go. Thank you, Mrs. Granger, said Nick, and he grabbed his backpack and headed for the door. And when he was just stepping into the hallway, he said, and I promise I won't ever forget my Frindle again. Bye!